Welcome to the Changing the Conversation Q&A series. This series consists of 4 parts, each of which expands briefly on the questions raised during the Changing the Conversation webinar series. A quick start webinar series providing invaluable insights to framing, hot topics related to implicit bias towards aging, and tools from the National Center and our partners. Before we begin, we would like to introduce the National Center to Reframe Aging, the trusted source for proven communication strategies and tools to effectively frame aging issues. The National Center is dedicated to ending ageism by advancing an equitable and complete story about aging in America. We are the nation's leading organization, cultivating an active community of individuals and organizations to spread awareness of implicit bias toward older people and influence policies and programs that benefit us all as we age. With us today is Joellen Labelle and Nancy Morrow-Howe, presenters from the Story of Aging in Our Communication portion of the webinar series. Thank you both for joining us today. I'd like to start by asking each of you to share one of your primary takeaways from your work on developing the Communications Best Practices Guide. Nancy, let's start with you.
Thanks, Hannah. It's so funny. Every time we go through the best practices, I always think, oh, this is the most important one. Oh, this next one's the most important one. And together, my takeaway was they really created so many awarenesses of how many different approaches and perspectives we can take as we're trying to, reframe aging. If I had to pick one, I would pick the heterogeneity in the older population. I think one of the most damaging things that our current narrative has in it is that the monolithic group of older adults who need protection in COVID, who need to retire at a certain time, who all have a chronic condition. The reality of the diversity in the population is something that we have to always lead with, when we're teaching, when we're thinking, when we're talking about later life. I better stop there because I can go on with important takeaways.
Joellen, your primary takeaway from this work?
I would say that it's really, we've got to start small, that everybody wants to, well, I won't say everybody, but a lot of people, once they hear of the best practices and we've talked to them about it, the takeaway I get from that is just people want to do it. They just don't know how. And for me, my perspective is the best way to do that is just to inch along, be like an inchworm, just do as you can, as much as you can, when you can. And I think it's just starting small, take one best practice, do that. But I think it's a good recognition for me that people do want to make this change and sort of improve how they're communicating about older adults, but they just don't know how to do it. And so we've just got to get this out there and help people.
Yeah, and if I could add, so tying to what I said, there's so many different ways to do one little thing. You can do it in terms of language or in terms of how you're educating about ageism. There's so many little things you can do, and it combines to what I think is another good just phrase for me was to tell the full and accurate story of aging.
And I think both of your primary takeaways resonate with audiences that engage with the National Center, specifically the audience that came to the webinar that you all presented in. During the webinar, one of the questions that brought up a lot of conversation was, can it sometimes be an unhelpful stereotype to assume that age makes you wiser too, just across the board? The comment was, people of all ages can experience issues with immaturity, irrational decision-making, and emotional regulation. And assuming people over a certain age are automatically smarter and wiser is something that's framed with some positivity, but isn't it still a little bit problematic? Nancy, I'm hoping you can comment on that.
Well, it is a stereotype. And I think what we're combating in general is stereotypes. So just because it's a positive stereotype doesn't mean that we should buy it. Or why wouldn't we buy a negative stereotype? Because rarely is anything always true about people. I think that how we've got going on old is wiser is because generally experience relates to wisdom. You know, we've been around that block. We know that this might work better than that, and that these alternatives. So it's true that, you know, older people are often more experienced just because of longevity, not even necessarily in a certain arena. So I agree that we shouldn't pound on this stereotype that old is wise. I think we need to recognize the advantage of experience in some ways, but again, not totally always true.
Joellen, anything you'd like to add?
I think Nancy got it exactly right. You know, one thing we're doing is combating stereotypes, and we can't do that with another stereotype. So we've got to just remind people that experience comes across the age spectrum, and we've just got to, that's one thing we've got to propagate.
So during the webinar, another question that brought up a lot of conversation was, do you think it's worthwhile of the energy, effort, resources to have alternative phrasing for senior centers? And Joellen, I'd like to invite you to start us, knowing that US Aging does a lot of work with area agencies on aging, and this question exists in that arena as well.
Yes, I will say that our members, and US Aging itself, we changed our name a few years ago, but I will say that we've seen a lot of area agencies on aging rebrand and change their names. Oftentimes, and it's not without a lot of thought, because this is a huge undertaking for it was for US Aging, but for area agencies on aging, which have so many other programs and services that they're delivering to their communities. And so it was I think we've seen that it's been a lot, like they've taken a lot of time to think about it and to do the work. So it's building those relationships in their communities. And a few of our members have told us that they decided to rebrand and change their names to take maybe the area agency on aging out of their name, because it helped them not only attract but deepen relationships with other with older adults and other people in their communities, because AAAs are serving more than just older adults. It's intergenerational grand families and people living with dementia who are span the age spectrum. So it's a lot of folks who and who may be turned off by something that says has aging in it. So they a lot of our members are doing that because they recognize that their communities are expanding, the people they serve are having growing needs that don't necessarily only relate to older adults. And so because of that, they're changing their names and sort of taking a look at that to see how they can market themselves in their communities to meet the needs of their communities.
Nancy, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I thank Joellen for that. The only thing I could add is two things. One, if we don't change who we are and what we do and how we think, who cares what we call ourselves? Right. So we got to remember these are labels, and it's what we do and how we think and how we program and how intergenerational we become and how age inclusive and diverse we become. Those are all important things. And so the name is secondary to our actions and behaviors and new programming and thinking. And on the other hand, I agree with Joellen that this has to evolve. It has to feel good to the constituents of the organization. I think it will evolve over time. Can't think there can be a mandate. We're all going to start saying this or be called that, or that'll backfire. But as agencies want to begin to change language, terrific. I think it's going to take a while.
During the webinar, one of the questions that encouraged a lot of conversation was understanding the length of time adapting some of these best practices might take. So can you speak to how long adapting the best practices outlined in the Communication Best Practices Guide might take for an organization, and even more generally, our communities and culturally, to adapt some of these ways of communicating and these communication strategies?
Go.
I can start, Nancy. And what I would just say is that, again, I almost want to challenge the notion of even thinking about how long it'll take. because it's not necessarily a matter of time, it's a matter of substance and content. And echoing what Nancy said in response to the last question, it really has to come from within. So you've got to get that organizational buy-in. You've got to make sure that your what you're talking about is understood by your audience and the people you're serving, if you're considering a rebrand or changing your name. But I think all of the best practices that we outlined really just take a little bit of time to for people to understand. It's that organizational buy-in, but then it's understanding that and embedding it within your programming, your work, and all of that. It's not, I wouldn't say it's, what is the phrase? It's not a marathon, or it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. We've got to take that sort of look at it, because it's not gonna, even though we want to finish it and we all agree, there's a lot of learning that we did as we were drafting the best practices. So just even for us, it takes a little bit of time. So I think just making sure that you're always looking at it and going back to it will help. But I don't want to necessarily think about it in terms of time. It's just something that will happen over time, and you'll see, day to day, year to year, that things will change and people's perceptions will change.
I could add that, I've changed since I've gotten involved with the Reframing Aging Initiative. I got involved early on when it started. So in a very short period of time, a handful of years, I have changed how I think and how I think and how I perceive, this whole story notion. So I think it's possible for individuals to start to see some change in themselves pretty quick. On the other hand, we've gotten to the situation where we are with our negative narratives and our ageist kind of ingrainedness over centuries. I don't think it's going to take centuries to change, but it's so ingrained and so invisible in us. It's going to take, as Joellen said, slowly, a while, bits and pieces here. But I do feel like the last decade or two in the field of aging, exponential change, fast change, positive views of aging, new models, new understanding about ageism. We didn't even talk about ageism 3 decades ago. Not totally true, but just the attention and the understanding and the research. So it seems like we're accelerating around these issues, which I think is a very favorable development.
I couldn't agree more. And we often say in our work, it's a generation's work, as you mentioned, Nancy. And I like the metaphor of a marathon as well, Joel, and that this is a long-term social change endeavor. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, which is a great reminder for folks to get started on the work, but also give yourself a break, that it's not something that you're expected to just snap your fingers and have happen. Thank you again for joining us for this part of the Q&A series. If you haven't seen the story of aging in our communications webinar featuring Joellen and Nancy, the link to the recording is in the description.